Okay, so our speaker tonight is Karen Evans, who's going to give us a talk about a grim almanac. I said that right? Grim Almanac of Staffordshire. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you. Well, just before I go on to my PowerPoint of excitement, just introduce myself a little bit. Obviously, as I say, my name's Karen Evans, and I've been researching my family history for about 35, 40 years. Started when I was very young. I like to pretend anyway. And I then started doing, I found a murder in my family, basically, a distant one in 1823. So I did quite a lot of research on that, and then decided that I'd like to I got so excited, I wrote it up and I sent it to Family Tree magazine, and they very kindly published it. And not only that, but they gave me money for it, which I thought was very cool. I know, I would have paid them to give me, but anyway. So then I've been sort of doing some writing on and off with Family Tree magazine. And so I thought to myself, well, I'm feeling very, I'm going to use the word cocky. I was feeling very cocky because I thought, oh, there I am. I'm some kind of amazing writer. So I sent off to the History Press with this idea for writing about some family history thing I'd found, and they went, no thanks, we're not interested, but we have got this Grim Almanac series that we do, and we can see that you write, and would you like to do that? So it was the Birmingham one I did first, and then I went on and did the Grim Almanac of Staffordshire, which is the one I'm going to talk about today. So since then I've been doing a lot more on DNA. So I actually write for the Family Tree magazine on a monthly article about using DNA to research your family history. So it's I have to talk about it in some way in every talk I do. So even though I'm doing a Grim Almanac of Staffordshire, it's got nothing to do with DNA. I have to bring it in some way, some form of fashion. So as Chris said, I'm not going to be doing every single story from the Grim Almanac. The point of the book was that I had to write 365 days. 366 if I could find a leap year event, which I did, but I was only allowed to write a paragraph or two, and some of the stories were really interesting, and I wanted to research them further, so I took on a few stories. So I sort of got some that I'm interested in, so hopefully there's ones that you haven't heard before, or if you have heard them before, it's some new bits of information that you might not have heard about. So I hope you enjoy those. So I'm just going to go on to my share screen, and I'm going on to my PowerPoint. Can everyone see that as a PowerPoint?
Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
Yep.
Lovely. Okay then, so I'm just going to close you up a little bit on the side so I can see my thing as well. Fantastic. So as I've just introduced myself, this is the front cover of my book, and then I'm going to tell you a few stories, so hopefully. The first story I'd like to tell you about is Anne Griffiths, who was murdered in 1844. The reason I chose Wednesbury is, if you can't tell by the accent, I am from the Black Country. I was born just up the road from Wednesbury. So I know I hide it very well, she says, lying through her teeth. I try not to have my Black Country accent come out too much, but it does when I get overexcited and get chatty too much, so I apologise in advance. So we're going to take you back. This is all information that I've been able to glean from newspapers of the time. So it's interesting, if you've ever looked at newspapers, you'll find that the information kind of gets distorted like Chinese whispers. So the stories that I'm going to tell today are taking what seems to be roughly the stories that I've been able to work out. They differ slightly in different newspapers, but this is basically what's going on. So we're starting off in Wednesbury, and basically Anne Griffiths is age 38, and she works for a gentleman, and I'm going to call him gentleman because he is, called John Crowther, who lives this street. This is obviously from 1844. This is the sort of this latest date that I could find, but a fairly affluent part of Wednesbury, and he runs stone pits in the local area. And so on this particular day, on the March the 16th, 1844, it's a Saturday, and John Crowther and the other live-in servant, whose name is Thomas Whitten. They go off at about 9:30 that morning, and it's quite a snowy morning. They go off to go and pay the gentlemen that work for them at the stone pits, so the workmen at the stone pits, leaving Anne Griffiths alone. Now, the John Crowther returns at approximately 1:45 and walks into his house, and he's quite disappointed because he notices that there are several doors that have been left open. The fire has not been lit in the main living room, that some of the other rooms that should be closed are open. And he's really quite cross about this, and he thinks Anna's been slacking off somewhat. And quite disappointedly, he starts calling around the house, asking Anne where she is, and getting no response. So he goes upstairs, thinking perhaps she's working upstairs or maybe gone to sleep upstairs. But no, she's not up there. But he does notice that several rooms seem to have been slightly disordered, and he does notice that in Anne's room some trunks have been open, and in his own rooms some things seem to be missing. So quite perturbed by now, thinking Anne's done something rather wrong, and she seems a very reliable lady who's been working with him for about 18 months. He goes down through the kitchen and into the brew house, and there is where he finds Anne. So we've got a little bit of information about Anne. To start with, John Crowther thinks that she has killed herself because he can see that there is an awful lot of blood, and it seems to be coming from her throat. He's obviously very shocked by this, and he goes straight outside the house, and Thomas Whitten is just coming in, and he says to Thomas Whitten, Anne's killed herself, Anne's committed suicide. But Thomas Whitten goes in and he thinks, goodness me, there's an awful lot of blood, but also this doesn't look like Anne has killed herself. So a surgeon is called, and he quite quickly is able to work out that Anne can't possibly have killed herself with the amount of wounds that she is showing. And you can see from the newspaper of the time that she has got, her throat has been cut down to the vertebrae, and that she's covered in blood. And what they did notice at the time was that the blood had congealed quite a lot. And that meant that she'd been dead, they felt, for quite a few hours. So you could see then they were looking, and the doctor realised that not only was she cut around the throat, but she seemed to have injuries to her hands as though she was protecting herself. And she seemed also to have some injuries on her head, which may or may not, according to the surgeon, have been what caused her death. But she seemed to have been dead for 3 to 4 hours. And the question was, what had happened to Anne? And of course, as soon as the story started going round, people started wondering what had happened to Anne. So the policeman at the time turned up, and they quickly noticed, and if you remember at the start, I said it was snowing, and they noticed that there were tracks leading from the brew house out of the door, that the door of the brew house was covered in blood, and there were tracks through the snow, and the tracks were quite distinctive in two ways. One, the track of the boot that the person was wearing showed they were quite big feet, and also the way there was obviously enough snow, because they were very, very clear about this. They could tell on the bottom of the shoes, on the boots, the way that the nails had been put in the base of the sole to obviously use for work, but also where the sole had been mended, if you like, and it was making quite a distinctive pattern. So by this time, obviously, several people had started hearing about this terrible crime, and they began sort of rushing to the house and saying various things. So the policeman follows the tracks down with a couple of other members of the public, and they go down to something, I don't know what it was, but it was called a whimsy. And at the whimsy, they find something that had been stolen from the house. At the same time, people start saying that they had seen a gentleman called William Beards, who used to work for John Crowther, and he'd been hanging around. The butcher's boy turns up, and he said that he tried to get into the house at about 10 past 10 and hadn't been able to get in. And he had heard a few sort of knockings about, but hadn't taken any notice of it, and had returned at 12 o'clock. And again, the house had been closed firmly shut. But at that point, he'd noticed William Beards hanging around on the outside of the house, and he'd walked away very quickly. Then several of the people started saying they'd seen William Beards, and these are some of the places that William Beards was allegedly seen. He was seen all over Wednesbury and many of the areas, mostly, interestingly, in several pubs, where he was spending rather a lot of money. Now, William Beards was known to be a itinerant worker, struggled to keep down a regular job, and it seemed an awful lot of money for him to be keeping. So he was seen in the various pubs, and he'd been seen moving across and over through Wednesbury, down into West Brom, and even going as far back as Walsall. Seemed, and like lots of people were quite concerned about this. So this made the policemen feel very suspicious of William Beards, and they traced him to his brother's house. And his brother lived in a street, this actual street, again, not of the time period, a high street in Bullen, it's called, in Wednesbury. And they found him sleeping in his brother's house with the bloodied boots next to him. So the policeman wakes him up. Policeman Hayden wakes him up and says to him, "You're Nick's son, basically. We think you have killed Anne Griffiths." He said, "I've not been there." He said, "I don't know what you're talking about. Nothing to do with me. You may have been wandering around and drinking a bit too much, but absolutely nothing to do with me." And the police points to the bloodied boots and said, "Well, you know, what about the bloodied boots?" He said, I lent them to somebody. So basically, from the time just before Anne was supposedly murdered until just about, well, like last night, they were returned to me. But between that time, this man who'd seen me wearing these big boots and said, "Go, they're big boots, aren't they? Do you mind if I borrow them?" So I lent him my boots, and that's why they've got blood on them. And needless to say, the policeman felt that was absolutely a load of codswallop, and he was quickly arrested, and he was taken to Wolverhampton lockup, where he was going to be held until there was an inquest. And the inquest decided that, yes, she had been murdered, and they felt that William Beards was definitely in the frame. So I'm not sure how many of you know much about the crime system in Victorian England, but once they have had the inquest, and they've decided, with the post-mortem and the inquest, they've decided that Anne was murdered, the trial would not be held by the quarter sessions. It would be seen as being a very serious crime, and he would be taken to the assizes. So he was taken to Stafford to be held there until the assize court would be able to come round, which would be at the end of July. So the assizes, unlike the quarter sessions, which were every quarter, the assizes only happened twice a year. And they happened in the March time, and then they happened in the summertime. And obviously, because of when he committed the crime, he was going to be tried by the Oxford. It was the Oxford circuit they were on. He was going to be tried at Staffordshire Assizes. So they started on the 27th of July, but his actual trial was the 2nd and the 3rd. And here's a picture of the Shire Hall, that it actually still exists as a building, if you like, and as a courtroom. So this is where William Beards would have been kept. So we hear various stories, and it soon becomes clear that people feel that though the evidence is circumstantial, as in the snowy boots, it seems very unlikely that William Beards would not have committed the crime. It's that no one could find the supposed other gentleman that borrowed the boots. He couldn't say where he had got the money from, and the jury then decided that he was going to be found guilty, and they went out. So the trial lasted a couple of days with all the evidence they had, but the jury took 20 minutes, came back and said he is guilty. Now, there was quite a lot of outcalling in the papers. They felt that this was very circumstantial He hadn't been seen with the murder weapon. He hadn't been found by Anne. And though he'd got blood on him, he said the blood had come from nosebleeds, which he often had. And people did feel that this was awful. So, you know, yes, there's some snowy footprints around it. He was walking around. Apparently the night before, he'd slept in a hayloft very close to John Crowther's building. So surely perhaps he'd gone round to the Crowthers to see if he could get some work because it was snowing and cold and he needed some money. However, it was soon decided that that wasn't the case. But once he was found guilty, the true story all came out. He decided that he was going to say exactly what had happened. And this is what he said happened. He said that he'd gone to the door, sure enough, not long after John Crowther had gone off to do his payments with Thomas Whitten and found Anne on her own. And he'd said to her, "Does Mr. Crowther need any jobs doing?" Anne apparently says, "You know he's not at home. I know you've come for stuff." In other words, you're going to come and nick things. Now, up until this point, William Beards had actually got quite a good reputation. He chased off some burglars a couple of years ago for John Crowther, but he had been a bit sort of lax in his work, and that's why he'd been let go. And he obviously felt that this was really quite off. And Beard said to Anne, he said, "You're saucy," for saying that to him. "You are saucy." And apparently, according to William Beards, she got a saucepan from the kitchen and said, if you don't be off, I'm going to throw hot water all over you. And he said he threw himself into a passion and picked up a carpenter's hammer and hit her over the head several times with it. Now, this is where you think, well, okay, fair enough, he did a crime of passion, but this is his actual sort of statement while he was waiting execution. And he actually said, yeah, he hit her and then she fell down. He then wandered around looking for things around the house. He takes several things from the house upstairs, comes back down and decides that he's going to cut her throat. And he actually says, "I think I would have lived if I'd not used the knife." He then takes the money from her purse that she'd had on her sort of inside her sort of skirt area. He went, sat down and ate a piece of fruit pie. Went out into the kitchen and apparently ate some food in there because Thomas Whitten said that he noticed some parts of food had also gone missing. Stole the silver spoons and took some clothing that was John Crowther's, which they then found at the Whimsy later, and walked out the door. And he basically did it because she'd been a bit saucy. Well, needless to say, all the thoughts that maybe this was a misadventure was put to rest. And I don't know again how much, I won't go too much into hanging in 1844, but William Beard, was taken to Stafford jail, where he was then hung on the 3rd of August. Now, what they used to do was they actually, if you can see the building at the top, what they used to do is they used to hang the people. So, because it was obviously a public hanging, it was a short drop. So the idea was that they would have like something they would stand on, and then they would, the prisoner would stand on it, get his last rites, admit what all the terrible things he'd done, and then they would kick away the thing he was standing on, and he would left to be hanging. But the last few times that had happened, the scaffold had fallen off the top, and people had all plummeted to the ground in front of the audience, and they felt that that wasn't really the best way of killing and executing people, by killing people on the ground as well. So they now had a little mobile executioners area, and as you can see, they would wheel it out for the waiting crowds, and then you can see there's probably enough space for 1 or 2 people to be hung there, but William Beards was the only gentleman to that day that was going to be hung, and he was hung from there until he was dead, and then his body was taken in to the grounds, and he was buried within the grounds. And that is the end that we know of William beards. So that's my sort of run through of one very quick story. Now, this story, I know that some of you may have heard this story before, but it's such an interesting story. I couldn't resist doing the death of John Parsons Cook and the very nefarious and very interested Dr. William Palmer. It intrigued me the very first time I saw about this in the newspapers. And so this is my interpretation of this story. So Dr. William Tyler's trail of death. So Dr. William Palmer lived in Rugeley, as some of you may be aware, and he seemed, I would say, unfortunate, maybe is the kindest way, with his family and friends in terms of deaths. William's mother-in-law, who was a known drunkard, to be fair to William, was living fairly close to them and had said that if she ever ended up in William's house, she wouldn't be alive a fortnight later. And sure enough, after being found very drunk in her own property and unable to look after herself, she was moved in to William's house with her daughter, and within 12 days she died. But William was able to say that it was from alcohol poisoning. The thought was that he was hoping that Mary Thornton's money would be coming to his wife, but in fact that didn't happen. Then there's also the list of his children. He did actually have one son that lived, but all the rest of the children, you can see, died very quickly, and many of them died from convulsions. Now, we all know as family historians that that is not an uncommon thing to happen. Many of our ancestors' children died, sadly, very young, sadly, sometimes within days or weeks of being born. But William Palmer and his wife did rather unfortunate with the amount of infant mortality they suffered. And one of the nursemaids at the house did say that when John died, just before little John died, aged 4 days old, she'd seen William Palmer giving him something from his finger. But it was felt that all the children had sadly been quite weak and this was let go. Then in April 1854, just after John's sad demise, Annie obviously, suffering after the death of her latest child, he decided it was perhaps best to get Annie's life insured, and he paid the premium of £760. And then she then took ill after a night out with a friend, came home, went to bed and never was risen again, and died aged only 27. Then, within a year, William had insured his brother Walter's life. Now, Walter was also a known drunkard, and he'd actually had a lot of problems getting Walter insured, and he'd got his great friend to sort of help him to say that Walter was well enough to be insured, that his life was insurable, if you like. And he insured his brother's Walter's life for £14,000, paid the first premium of £710, and sadly, Walter died aged 32. It seems such an unfortunate amount of people dying. But, it's the 1850s. Those sort of things do happen. But now we're in November 1855. William Palmer has gone to Shrewsbury races with his friend John Parsons Cook and other close friends. Now, John Parsons Cook was 28 years old, and he'd come into an unexpected inheritance of £12,000. And he was basically living the life of Riley. He was having a fantastic time. And he spent a lot of the money on food and drink and gambling, and particularly horse racing. So on Tuesday, the 13th of November, 1855, William Palmer, John Parsons Cook, and some gentleman called Cheshire, who was the Rugeley postmaster, were at Shrewsbury races, and Cook won about £3,000 on his horse Polestar when it came first in the Shrewsbury handicap race. So there all much rejoicing was had, and they went back to the Raven in Rugeley, and though William Palmer couldn't stay, apparently Cook treated all of his friends to foaming beakers of provincial champagne. However, the next day, William Palmer had returned and they went again to Shrewsbury races. Now, unlike Cook, who was, if you like, swimming in lard, William Palmer was the exact opposite. Regardless of all this money that he should have got from insurances, he was heavily in debt, maybe as much as £8,000 or £10,000 by sort of that standard. So, a substantial amount. And so he returns the next day, and that evening comes and dines with the gentlemen who have stayed at Shrewsbury races and are now at the Raven Inn. Now, he's seen by a lady called Mrs. Anne Brooks putting some fluid into a small bottle or into a tumbler and shaking it up. But he doesn't seem bothered by her seeing that, and she doesn't notice or think much of it at the time. And then William Palmer walks back into the room and he gives a drink to John Parsons Cook, who, as soon as he drinks the drink, jumps up and complains that the drink has burned his throat. But William Parsons Cook is sort of, oh, I think I've been poisoned. But William Palmer is saying, oh, no, you don't be silly, you're being over the top, and takes a sip of the drink and seems absolutely fine. But John Parsons Cook, quite quickly after that, starts complaining that he doesn't feel very well.